All right, we're going to proceed with our second to the last panel, the global perspective. If you could all come and take your seats. Have you enjoyed the session so far? That's weak. That's weak. Have you really enjoyed the session so far? Yeah. Good job. I mean, the high schoolers are gone, so you're going to have to take over. So let me introduce Morgan DeFort. He is the CEO and co-founder with Dr. Brian Wilson, Factor E, and he's going to take it from here. Morgan, please give a very warm welcome to these gentlemen up here on stage.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it, and really enjoying the conference so far today. I think it's been a great couple of days. We're going to continue on, and I think bring in a really interesting discussion to what we've already had today. Interestingly, I think we've already touched on it in many previous presentations to some extent, is that's really the global perspective. And I think the reason that you've seen some comments come up around global perspectives is that really it's really where the momentum is in energy right now to an amazing extent. And if you're not having the conversation globally, you're not really having the conversation. So in 2005, something really important happened. Non-OECD demand for energy actually exceeded OECD demand for energy. And we have seen that not look back, right? So going forward to 2030, 90% of demand growth for energy is coming from non-OECD countries. And that's primarily China, India, really leading the pack around that. And so if we see China, India, and I want to talk a little bit about Africa as really green spaces for energy demand, I think it's really critical that we talk about how are those places going to develop energy? How are they going to use energy? We have over 1 billion people that lack access to energy. If they consume energy the way we historically have, it will put tremendous pressure on both our natural resources and our environment and climate. The interesting thing, though, is we're already seeing that that's not going to happen. We're transitioning our energy systems, and we're seeing already China, India, and Africa develop their energy systems in remarkably different ways than we have, but also in remarkably different ways than each other. And so I'm going to try and set the stage a little bit today. We have 3 fantastic panelists who are going to talk about and share their perspectives from a global view. But I'm going to set the stage a little bit around looking at India, China, and Africa, excuse me, and the interplay between them, and why it's really important for us, whether we're focused in Colorado or the West, to really actually be engaged globally, and how many of the companies that we're talking about here today, or that with us today, actually already engaged quite actively globally. So, let's talk about China a little bit. So we've already seen, certainly in Amri's comments yesterday, several times today, discussions of how fast China is moving. I think the really startling, jaw-dropping quote from Amri last night, I believe it was Amri, but it was 3 football fields an hour of PV that's being installed in China right now. India is following in China's path, although in their own way, okay? So 500 million people in India have gained access to electricity since 2000. So in the last 17 years, 500 million people. The pace has accelerated in recent years, an additional 40 million people gaining access each year since 2011. Really amazing. And India is actually on pace to meet, for India, the SDG goal 7 of universal energy access before 2030, which I really, 3 years ago even, I think you would doubt whether or not they were going to hit that target. Still difficulties in rural areas getting the penetration there, but large gains in energy access in India, although nearly all of those who've gained access since 2000 have done so as a result of new connections to the grid. So pretty conventional way of connecting up, getting attached to the Indian central grid, which is fairly heavy carbon intensive, right? It's driven by coal, and we see, like other places in the world, increasing renewables, but a pretty traditional approach, really heavily policy-driven towards gaining energy access. Africa, though, compared to China and to India, is lagging. Providing electricity for all by 2030 will require an annual investment of $52 billion per year, more than twice the level that has been mobilized currently. Of that additional investment, 95% needs to go into sub-Saharan Africa. So, we are seeing great leadership in China. We're seeing momentum in India. We're seeing still a big challenge in Africa. And we see continued population growth in Africa. Nigeria will be larger than the United States, largest economy in Africa 2 years ago, and I think their population will be one of the largest countries in the world by 2050. And a fundamentally different approach to energy access happening in Africa. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that we're not necessarily driving any of these things. So 30% of all energy investment happening in Africa, of this 52 billion that's required, is coming from China. And so we're actually seeing much more interaction between China, India, and Africa as they build out an energy infrastructure and look to determine their future. And so I think, I'm going to make the case as we go through the panel and have the discussion that disruptive technology is really playing an interesting role in Africa. The nature of the capital that's coming in to emerging markets is different in China than it is in India, than it is in Africa. There's a lot of opportunity for us to be participating in these markets. But where we see the ability for technology to interact, we still see the need for stronger policy. And where we see solutions that require policy, we see things lagging. So with that little bit of table setting to just get us started, I want to introduce our first speaker, and we're going to just have them go through, make a few comments. We're going to have a little Q&A, and then we'll open it up to the audience. But Rod Ringham is the Executive Director of Business Development and Education at the Gas Technology Institute, or GTI. He's been the acting chairman on the coordination committee for the International Gas Union, so he's overseen a wide array of activities and is leading up to the World Gas Conference in DC. So Rod has a global perspective and would love to start the panel today with Rod talking a little bit about his perspective globally.
Great. Thanks, Morgan. Pleasure to be here in a tremendous event. Thanks for hanging in there for day 2. It's been a fantastic 2 days. First time we've been involved at this overall event. I'm new to Colorado. We moved here this July and love the state, and this event is just a great characteristic of the overall energy and the beauty of the state. So as Morgan said, I'm going to talk a bit about the overall kind of global perspective from our perspective, and I guess 2 organizations that Morgan kind of characterized that we're involved in, or that I'm involved in. GTI, we're based in Chicago. I'm in Colorado now, fortunately, but our labs are there. We've got 28 different labs focused on the entire value chain of the gas industry, from upstream unconventional gas through infrastructure and LNG and into kind of energy efficiency utilization technology. So we get involved in kind of the technology and the research and the tech services, education and training for the kind of broader gas industry, predominantly domestic, but increasingly international. And you referenced kind of India and China, doing a fair bit of work in those countries in the Southeast Asia region. Probably more so, though, today, I'll spend some time talking about the International Gas Union, IGU, activities. This is an organization based in Barcelona, and the U.S. has the presidency of this organization until the World Gas Conference in June of next year in Washington. So our secretariat's in Barcelona, but we're developing that program for the overall event, and we've got about 1,000+ volunteers from across the globe, kind of looking at kind of different technologies and issues for natural gas and kind of natural gas as it relates to kind of broader energy picture. And I guess one thought that came to mind as I was listening here the last couple of days, it's probably been consistent as we've kind of worked through IGU activities, but a lot of the issues that are being addressed within Colorado, within the States, within North America, we're seeing the same thing in South America, the same thing in Asia, to some degree the same thing in Africa, but often common issues that we're addressing kind of at different parts of the world. So IGU, just so you have a sense, it's 92 charter members, so basically the American Gas Association is one charter member. So we've kind of got those organizations from different countries around the world and work towards the kind of advocacy and programs and kind of the technology and policy development for the gas industry globally. Again, working towards the World Gas Conference in DC next year. So just, I guess, in terms of the overall bottom line, we're seeing a very bullish and strong future for the overall gas industry. Certainly challenges, some of those have been identified over the past couple of days, and again, consistent with kind of discussions within the broader IGU community. You can see on the chart on the right-hand side of this slide here, just kind of the projected growth in different countries and regions of the world. The yellow portion on the right-hand side of that chart shows the incremental growth up to the year 2040. So you can see U.S., some incremental growth, predominantly on power generation and perhaps industrial activity, but efficiency kind of offsets that from a commercial, residential, domestic perspective. The larger growth you're seeing in China, India that we referenced, Africa, and Latin America. So we're seeing kind of very strong growth overall, but predominantly outside the developed areas. And we've heard a lot about this over the past couple of days. Certainly renewables are advancing, great to see in terms of the costs coming down, the capacity that this slide shows kind of continuing to increase. We're seeing, again, that in all parts of the world continuing. We're also seeing natural gas as a natural partner for renewables, and so we're working through IGU. The report there shown on the right-hand side, and all these are available on the IGU website as kind of white papers or downloadable reports. But looking at kind of gas as a partner, either from a offsetting maybe fluctuations in either daily or seasonal demand from renewables, perhaps power to gas technologies, hydrogen as an infrastructure, as a element from power to gas into the grid, biogas into the grid, perhaps CHP either from a standalone or a district heating perspective. So in terms of smart energy systems, the integration of gas and renewables, an area that you're seeing a lot of focus on within IGU and within GTI, both technology and policy perspectives around that kind of broader, I think, opportunity. In addition to solar and wind and renewables in general, we're certainly seeing shale continue to increase, and we're all aware of kind of the impact of shale domestically in Colorado. We're seeing impact, as you'll see, from an LNG and a demand perspective kind of globally. This chart just shows the cost efficiency that we're seeing over the past 3 or 4 years from different basins around the U.S. in terms of productivity increases in production at lower unit costs, in addition to kind of lower environmental footprint for shale. So a lot of activity in terms of overall optimizing that overall production process. Again, the majority of that's been North America-based, predominantly U.S.-based. We're seeing a lot of activity. We mentioned China, so we're doing some work with USTDA, U.S. Trade Development Agency in China, to introduce shale to kind of the Chinese market. DOE EIA put out some reports that kind of show the global resource for shale, and it actually is multiples of what the U.S. Currently has in terms of resource in the ground in China and other parts of the world. So expect that impact to continue not only currently but into the foreseeable future from international producers. So LNG, I guess, as a element of kind of the shale activity, LNG, it's 280 million tons currently in terms of the global supply and demand at a balanced level, but getting to maybe 500 million tons by 2030, so almost doubling over the next 15 or so years. We're seeing impact certainly within the U.S., the Cheniere terminal in Sabine Pass in Louisiana. I think they've shipped 200 cargoes. I heard from them last week, 200 cargoes so far from that terminal to 25 different countries. So a lot of activity, from the shale and impacting LNG kind of globally. And as you've probably seen with all the export licenses and activity and the investment in shale that Morgan references, there's a lot of, I guess, continued growth and expected demand growth from an LNG perspective. One area of which is kind of transportation, LNG bunkering. So using LNG as a fuel for shipping or for heavy-duty applications. There's some IMO, International Maritime Organization, regulations coming out on sulfur that's really driving a lot of this growth in maritime markets, but we expect that to continue then to other heavy-duty operations. And again, this was addressed as well, and I know CSU has done a tremendous job here in terms of developing kind of clean energy options for areas that are suffering energy poverty and we're looking at LPG, liquefied propane gas, or natural gas as an element of that as well from a cooking or a power generation perspective in parts of the world. So again, an area of emphasis for both GTI as well as IGU going forward. Again, this is probably addressed to some degree here as well, but these two reports that you see on the right-hand side of this slide, IGU has put out a couple of these over the past few years, and they're predominantly case study white papers looking at use of gas for enhancing urban air quality. So looking at Beijing, looking at I think 5 European cities. We looked at New York and Toronto, looking at kind of heating systems, power generation, transportation options that use gas and as a means to really help address the overall urban air quality issue in all parts of the world, developed and developing aspects from a energy perspective. Methane emissions, again, this has been touched upon to a degree. Certainly the U.S. and the North American industry is kind of focused on this in terms of mitigation, measurement, and controlling and addressing kind of methane emission across all segments of the industry, from upstream through infrastructure through energy efficiency impact. But we're also seeing this as an element of kind of global interest as well from an IGU perspective. So a lot of activity. A report that I don't show on this slide, but this just came out last week that IGU put out on case studies on methane emissions. And again, so it's an area that we have an active committee and an active task force looking at kind of solutions and communication of the gas industry perspective and the solutions to this issue, but then also ongoing activity that you'll see on the website and in kind of continued operations. I guess as part of that, and we're proud to be connected to CSU, so in these very rooms, in a month and a half roughly, we'll be having a session focused on a much deeper dive into methane emissions. So we're going to have the tech developers. We heard from some, I think, earlier this morning. We'll have the researchers, the academics, but also industry and policymakers that are involved in methane emissions for the industry in one room, talking about kind of the measurement technology, looking at kind of policy issues, look at best practices being applied by industry. So really a very broad-based session. This will be, I think, the third or fourth time we've done this particular event. It continues to kind of grow in interest, and I think we're seeing, I guess from this panel's perspective, a greater involvement in international organizations and companies as part of that overall event. So if you're interested in this topic, a lot more to be said on that in about a month and a half in these same seats. And then Morgan mentioned, I guess the culmination of our activity with the IGU, with the International Gas Union, is the World Gas Conference next year in DC. Certainly would love to see you all there, but it's going to be a sizable event. We'll have about 12,000 people there, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 attendees for the conference itself, 400 exhibitors, and 40,000 square meter exhibit space. So we're going to take over the entire city, including the Walter E. Washington Convention Center for the last week of June of next year in DC. So again, welcome to that event. So just, I guess, to wrap up the initial comments here, overall from both a GTI and IGU perspective, we're very bullish and we see a strong future for gas. We see the connection with renewables. Certainly a lot of activities and areas of kind of coordination underway both within and beyond the gas industry. So we're seeing that both within the developed areas and the developing areas. And I think forums like this and what we're going to have in Washington, D.C. just are going to further kind of make those connections and further the progress of the overall industry. So appreciate your attention. Thank you very much, and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Rod. So up next we have Jeff Holton. Jeff is the General Manager for Marketing Strategy and Fundamentals at Anadarko Petroleum. He's been involved in global commodity markets and helped the company in strategic and commercial business decisions. I also want to understand what that fundamentals piece is, so you might get to try that. He's had 23 years of experience in international oil and gas markets, been stationed in Houston, LA, London, and Singapore, and so has a global perspective. And love to hear a little bit, Jeff, from you on this topic.
Thank you very much, Morgan. Pleasure to be here. I'm a former Colorado educated, maybe a different university, don't hold that against me, but enjoy coming to Colorado all the time. So I'm going to spare you having to go through some more slides. I'm going to keep my comments actually very brief. I think the benefit of forums like this is the dialogue and debate between some of the panelists, so I'm going to be really quick. I think the first thing I'd like to put out there is, I hope there's not sort of a perception that as a producing company, sort of how we view the world is with our feet on the desk, close the blinds, smoke cigars, and sort of oblivious to the trends that are happening in the world around us. I'm here as living proof to tell you that's not true. In fact, I lead a very small but unique and highly talented team that does exactly that for our company. We look deep. Our sole focus really is to understand trends in the energy market and how those are impacting the commodities that we do business in, whether that's electric vehicles' impact on transportation fuels, what's happening in power generation globally. These are all, very important to us as a company, and how those trends go moving forward says a lot about what our corporate strategy is as well. So just hope, let everybody know we do like to look out the window every once in a while, and we only smoke cigars on Casual Friday. So that's a joke. We're a smoke-free environment. Please don't quote me on that. But so anyways, sort of on the topic of global gas, we share a lot of the same as Rod has just put out. We think global gas market is a very interesting market for us from a global hydrocarbon demand. It is obviously the fastest growing. A lot of that is due to industrial demand moving forward, but we see also power generation as being the main focus for gas demand. Rod deals in BCMs, I deal in TCF. It's currently about 125 TCF a day today. We see it moving to 150 in as little as 15 years. That's huge growth for gas demand. And it's really, that growth is being driven, as Morgan mentioned earlier, to non-OECD or non-developed countries who don't have a lot of their own indigenous supply of gas. And so LNG will likely be sort of that bridge to help these countries meet that growth, find cleaner forms of energy. As a company, we feel like we're uniquely positioned. We have a project we're trying to get off the ground in Mozambique, which is a very large gas find on the east coast of Africa. It's uniquely situated in the sense that it's close to the Middle East and China. If you remember from Rod's numbers, those are where we see the most growth in gas. Today, the LNG market's challenged, much like the oil market today. We're sort of in an oversupply situation. It's a buyer's market, so we're working very hard in order to find buyers in the future for that. Again, as Rod mentioned, it's a quickly growing market, 260, 280 metric tons per annum right now, and could easily double in the next 30 years. So that being said, today it's oversupplied. It won't take very long before we're looking for new supplies of LNG to sort of fuel this and provide supply of cleaner forms of energy to parts of Asia. So, very interested in having a discussion with this panel. It's obviously very talented, and look forward to the discussion. That's all I have.
Thank you. Next up, we have Morgan Bazilian, who is a fellow at the Center for Energy Policy at Columbia University. He also has the credentials of being named Morgan, very, very strong energy name. But he's been involved in fiscal policy, systems analysis, and infrastructure investment globally, been involved in market regulations, a lot of different aspects when we look at energy as a system. He's a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Advisory Council on Energy. He served as advisor to the IEA's World Energy Outlook and Bloomberg New Energy Finance's Global Energy Outlook. Worked with NREL, the UN, et cetera. We're very pleased to have Morgan here today, and please do contribute. Thank you, Morgan.
Thanks very much, and thanks to Governor Ritter and the team for inviting me to the event. It's an honor to be here, and I think it's terrific you've decided to have a session looking outside of Colorado and the West, as I'm now going to call him the other Morgan. As the other Morgan said, the facts are pretty clear that the energy demand, and of course, along with it, energy investment is moving to non-OECD countries. And for those of you that don't use that nomenclature every day, that is essentially the countries outside of the United States, Europe, and Japan. So that's where all the business is, that's where all the demand growth is, that's where all the action is. So that's where all the need for good planning is, that's where the need for good policy making is, that's the need for innovation, all of that. So while it's the focus on the United States and the wealthy countries is usually the highlight at energy events, the fact remains that the rest of the world is going to be much more significant in every way in the energy sector. All of my work is in developing countries. I don't work in OECD countries very much anymore. And when we think about this energy transition, there's a very different narrative between the energy transition as you think of it in the United States or in Europe, and how you think of it in the rest of the world, right? So and just for the sake of discussion here and with you, I put up 8 bullet points here of things we might touch on. I'll just say them briefly and then leave the side. We can go through any one of them, but they're different. They have different contours than how you would think of it here. There's major institutional shifts in how things are happening in the multilateral world. Just today, the director of the IEA welcomed Brazil as an associated country to the International Energy Agency. That might not resonate with most people, but the fact that they're bringing in developing countries into the IEA's sort of wealthy nation club is significant and showing the change in the realities we first described about the developing countries moving, being where the game is, so to speak. The trade and growth in natural gas has been covered by my colleagues, but that is a significant piece of developing country realities and how those markets look vis-a-vis what the price is in Asia versus Latin America versus North America for the LNG trade is significant, and also technology aspects of LNG. In other words, the smaller floating units are making it more attractive or less attractive depending on the market. There are clearly issues about intellectual property at research, development, manufacturing of these clean energy technologies or new technologies, including in oil and gas, and how they either get translated or occur in developing countries. There's significant issues of cybersecurity. Those are not limited to the United States, despite what people may think. They are significant all over, and as the IT and other areas of smart grids start to diffuse widely, those become more significant. And what we see in utilities all over the world is while the utilities in the United States and Europe usually have or always have a cybersecurity expert in them, that's not always the case in the rest of the world. There is a changing landscape for minerals and metals because of what this energy transition might look like. So if we assume that there's going to be a large-scale adoption of electric vehicles, batteries for storage, photovoltaics, that will all have implications for the mineral and metal markets around the world. There has been some breathy articles in places like Bloomberg recently about, say, how the Democratic Republic of the Congo holds 63% of the current production of cobalt, as an example. And if you haven't been to the DRC, you may not know that that will be a challenge. That's diplomatic language. There's growing interconnection on electricity grids. There's a project right now that the World Bank is working on that connects, I'm going to get the countries wrong, in Central Asia to all the way through Afghanistan and to Pakistan. And if you think the trade between the Western grid and ERCOT, or the trade between Colorado and some other states is difficult, you haven't been looking hard enough. The enormous issue plaguing developing countries is that there's still about 1 billion people that don't have access to electricity. There's at least 2 or 3 billion people that have access to poor quality electricity, which is in some cases worse and stifles economies and everything else that exists today. So the numbers we were talking about when the governors were up here of the population of Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana, of course, pales compared to that. I did note that they had leather chairs, and we've shifted to these. I'm not sure what's that signaling, but there's also a lot of new ways to think of energy planning, and I think that the regulator from the PUC here in Colorado is talking about these scenario planning and regulation. The regulatory environment, how do you regulate the power system in South Sudan? You don't use that graph he showed. And so you have to make a very difficult and different calculation on how you optimize things, and you have to look at areas of risk in very different ways than you look at them here. And so that's another one of these 8 areas. I think I'll stop there. I have some compelling images, Morgan, to show, and I'll just briefly go through them. One of them is showing gas flaring. The World Bank Group runs something called the Global Gas Flaring Partnership. These are just examples that show the intertwined complexity of these issues. This is a bunch of children playing on high pressure gas pipelines because their school next door doesn't have lights. Yeah. So so that there's an enormous amount of complex issues to deal with there. In a country that produces that gas flared there, the gas flared, say, in the Niger Delta and the certain parts of Nigeria is enough to easily power the current amount of generation in Africa, the entire subcontinent of 800 million people. And then I know, Morgan, you mentioned this paper at some point in our earlier discussions, and a few years ago we wrote a paper about what if you thought of domestic demand in these countries being different, so that companies like Anadarko, when they're doing their calculus between LNG shipment and internal, would think about both, and they are. And this looks at what if there was a vibrant, say, fertilizer industry, or what if there was different uses for natural gas and an infrastructure for it in sub-Saharan Africa. Those are big what ifs, by the way, but just something to think about. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm going to jump into the discussion a little bit, and playing off of that, I think, so what we do at Factory Ventures is we invest in early stage technology companies that are trying to bring energy solutions to emerging markets. We do a lot in agriculture, actually, because fertilizer is energy. It is basically natural gas. Agriculture is a big player in these markets. But I spend a lot of time thinking and talking with folks about how innovation leads to private sector investment, which we need in these spaces, and private sector investment leads to infrastructure and access and markets. Historically, we have looked to innovation, technology innovation and R&D inside the United States, and wind power is a great example. We saw earlier the drop in levelized cost of electricity from wind going from 60 cents to 5 cents, largely through a lot of technical innovation that happened down the road at NREL, right? And that innovation trickles around the world. It's probably a not clearly direct path, but my colleagues from NREL will definitely credit some of their work to what we see now as far as wind turbine technology in China. So historically, the US has influenced the world through our R&D leadership, our technology leadership, our innovation leadership. The last 5 to 7 years, we've had continued decrease in R&D spending in the US as a whole. Are we moving to a space where the leadership comes from access to cheap capital, a la China, versus leadership through technology innovation, a la what we've done in the United States for a long time? And how do we have a positive influence in these markets and be at the table if we're not either investing cheap capital into deployment or investing in technology and R&D leadership? And I think that's critically important, especially when we talk about Jeff, your company has a find and a large opportunity off the coast of Mozambique to address the energy poverty problem that we saw in your presentation, Rod, would require the infrastructure that Morgan mentioned, but also, very honestly said, look, it's a far cry to imagine that kind of African domestic gas infrastructure being built. So it seems to me like we have this huge gap. We're not investing as much in innovation, and we seem, at least from a US perspective, pretty nervous about investing in infrastructure in emerging markets. And therefore, how will we ever see some of these potential opportunity realized? I think the paper that Columbia produced that Morgan was an author on basically showed that through fertilizer, power generation, and cooking, you had enough demand domestically in sub-Saharan Africa at roughly 2 to 3x the cost or the consumer price demand than you would to have international LNG exports. So how do we tackle innovation? Do we tackle finance? How do we make this infrastructure happen? How do we have our place at the table internationally?
I guess I could add a couple comments on that, and I'm sure the other panelists will chime in as well. From our perspective, I guess from a GTI, a gas technology perspective, we're seeing, I guess, the evolution of kind of shale, as I mentioned, I guess, in the slides there, but the impact of that on a price perspective. So you look at the prices in Asia for LNG imported there, and so you certainly see impact of technology within the U.S. and having a global impact on kind of the financials and the markets in Asia, as you kind of see delivered LNG prices down from $20 to $6 or $7 I saw last week for some of the cargoes coming in. So huge economic impact there. Agree with you then on the investment in R&D perspective, we're certainly seeing a decrease in that area, and we'd certainly support an increase as well. But we're also seeing, I think, greater efficiency and probably more collaboration in some of those activities. We run a couple of collaboratives for the gas industry domestically on kind of operation technologies and utilization technology development. And so there's leverage and there's more efficiency in kind of developing that. Maybe we're getting kind of smarter about getting market data in, so we're developing maybe the right product at a more optimal pace. So we're seeing some of that. We're also seeing now, and I guess through the IGU, the international activity, we're seeing more involvement from international companies. I guess, like I'd mentioned, the issues that we're facing, we're seeing that kind of echoed in other parts of the world. So we're seeing more interest now from other parts of the world coming to the U.S. and kind of looking at solutions that we've developed, and that's certainly having an impact on their market. So, and then the final point, I guess, is with U.S. TDA that I referenced. Certainly with shale in China, we're using we're up the learning curve, and we're helping them get up the learning curve a lot quicker. It'd be the same in other parts of the market. We're seeing the same now with some delegations coming in from China on heavy-duty vehicles, and so transportation markets. So across the board, I think they're just going to be increasingly interconnected, not just with LNG and energy, but information now. So.
I'll just add a little bit and maybe set up Morgan with another comment. I think from a demand side, R&D, tough for us as a sort of our position as a smaller independent producer to influence that much. I will say, as part of the Mozambique project, we probably spend, I was going to say equal, maybe even more time really focused on the markets we're adjacent to, trying to understand those markets. Is there an opportunity for us there, as we do to the very obvious high demand markets such as Japan or China. So there's an effort there. We recognize that less transportation, there's all sorts of benefits for us. I think you hit on the key point that we see, at least from our perspective, is the financing aspect of some of that infrastructure. Very difficult in a lot of these countries that have no established credit or are deemed a credit risk to go in and do massive infrastructure investments or the like, and so that becomes, the World Bank is an opportunity for that. I'll let Morgan comment more on that. I'd say specifically some of the things we've seen, particularly in the LNG market, is the rise of the floating storage regasification units, FSRUs. So these are smaller ships that provide capability. You can park these offshore just about anywhere. Relatively low cost when you're talking about an onshore LNG regasification. They're offshore, so there's the risk is slightly different than a major investment onshore. And it's really opening up a bunch of markets for LNG that wasn't there before these sort of came into existence. So they're the acronyms FSRUs have really, and particularly with LNG prices at where they're at now, these have become quite popular. And we've seen in a lot of developing countries the FSRUs really spurring demand. So that's not so much of a technological innovation, but definitely something that sort of bridges both issues, the technology and some of the financing or credit aspect of it that makes it difficult to make those kinds of investments.
Thank you. Look, I think the question you asked is too big to answer in one thing. So my brain doesn't work that way, but I think you have the opportunity. I don't know if he's in the room right now, but Dan Arvisu, who used to run NRail, is here and giving one of the closing speeches on the innovation side. I think he's the person to talk to about the U.S. innovation side, and I'd be fascinated to hear what he has to say about it. I guess two points I can sort of touch on areas where you're talking about. One is that there's often a dichotomy presented, which I think is a false dichotomy when looking at how do you service these markets with energy services, say poorer markets with energy services. What do you do? Is it private sector? Is it public sector? Is it off-grid? Is it mini-grid, et cetera? The answer, of course, and sort of boringly, is you're going to need all of that. And the way you get to that analytically, since there's a lot of professors and students in the room, is one way you get to it is, one thing we did was, there's a new open source energy model. It's called Osmosis, and there's a couple other cute acronyms because they're developed in Europe and they love the acronyms. It is, you take a traditional sort of expansion planning or least cost model and you put in modern assumptions about photovoltaics and wind and onshore and offshore and on-grid and off-grid and mini-grids and all the rest. And then you run the numbers sort of in a fair, open way and see what the countries come out with. And one example is if you look at, say, Nigeria versus Ethiopia. Nigeria has a really nice infrastructure set. The model runs a sort of, it's agnostic, right? So it runs for least cost. And what it'll show is, well, in Nigeria, it probably makes sense cost-wise to go for something like 90% grid and then you fill in the rest. Whereas in Ethiopia, that has a much different type of demographic, that you might see a lot more, say, mini-grids or off-grid with a couple corridors of grid. So that's one way of touching your question. In other words, how do you think of it from a planning perspective? And the other way is, what do you, and I think both my colleagues up here said, what do you think of it in terms of money? How do you fund it? And well, I think there's a couple ways to look at that. One is that you need these, and I'm sorry for this is a terrible term, but the enabling environment. But and this is the kind of stuff that the regulator was talking about. But you need some level of functioning rules and regulations that allow for people to transact these things in a safe way. And that is not apparent in a lot of these countries. And so you have to build that at the same time as providing some kind of risk capital. There's various ways you can do that. There's partial risk guarantees, there's guarantees for the private sector, there's sovereign guarantees, there's say a matrix, you could say, of those guarantees of, say, 10 to 15 boxes of tools you can use. So I think somewhere in between the planning and the money, you can get to parts of your question. And you notice I haven't used the word technology there, so that's a different piece. Dan's way better at that than I am anyway.
So another line that I think is interesting is that in these markets we have seen incredible leapfrog opportunities, and we're always looking for the next leapfrog that mimics, the cell tower telecom story, right? We never put in telecom wires in Africa and large parts of India. And now we have in Africa, cell phone ownership is much higher than access to energy. So there are a lot more people who own cell phones than there are people who can figure out how to charge them, which is amazing. And so, question for you all is, what are the next leapfrog opportunities? Because where we do have difficulty with the policy front in some of these emerging markets, on some of the other fronts, like, for example, solar home systems, which are a consumer-facing product, it doesn't involve regulation. We've seen 200 to 300% growth in that sector. We have the top 3 to 5 companies which have raised over $350 million from Silicon Valley in the last 18 months. They've brought energy access, at least at a minimum or basic level, to 25 million people in the last few years. Incredible growth. And my question for you all is, are electric vehicles potentially the next leapfrog opportunity for emerging markets, where we will see transportation go and leap right over traditional methods and see more electric vehicles, although they may be 2- and 3-wheeled? And what implications might that have, given that on one hand, it seems like it might be a very fast adoption potential, especially as we talk about incredibly reduced costs of electric vehicles. On the other hand, we're potentially trying to then tax a very weak electrical infrastructure with a new load. And so just kind of curious your thoughts. And I think actually, for Rod and Jeff, that actually natural gas has a role to play in that. So curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I guess a couple thoughts on that as well. And Jeff made the comment on the LNG, the floating storage regas units, and just, I guess, smaller scale LNG in general. And you're seeing kind of flex uses for LNG regas or import terminals, where you're developing maybe transportation infrastructure off of that. You're doing perhaps small scale LNG shipped to remote areas off of that. So from a leapfrog perspective, I think LNG offers that similar opportunity. And I guess one other point I guess I'd make on that would be, the other aspect would just be the development of this integrated smart energy grid that integrates kind of the renewables that certainly will be a big part of it. Then how does gas play into that? From a CHP perspective or from a kind of load balancing perspective. So, if you're building from the ground up, you can certainly design that, from an optimized perspective.
A great question. That's a tough one to answer. I think, maybe for the sake of debate and dialogue, I think it's still an unanswered question. And if Emery's in the room, I'm going to hear it. But, are really EVs a leapfrog here in the U.S.? There was an interesting report from an investment bank that came out not too long ago that suggests, they're too similar to existing cars. It's a car with a battery. They don't, as of now, they don't have that same innovative technology cost savings that, say, a light bulb did versus burning kerosene, that's caused that rapid, uptake in demand of that. Same with horse and buggy to the first car. There was a tremendous amount of cost savings associated with that, which helped push its adoption. So I think it would have its challenges, obviously. Very much the gas, having more mobile gas that can transit other parts of the world allows for that capability to provide electrical charging. But keep in mind, the regular movements of hydrocarbons are also pretty sufficient or efficient to do a lot of energy in tankers. So I guess from our perspective, we're not sure that EVs specifically may represent that level of leapfrog technology, at least from what we see today.
A couple of things. One, I think the mobile telephony leapfrogging analogy is overplayed in terms of how it relates to energy services. The money from Silicon Valley going primarily into 2 countries in East Africa is wonderful. It's going into business models that are leapfrogging, not necessarily technologies or systems that are leapfrogging. And those business models are, as you say, largely outside of regulation, or some people would say because of a lack of regulation that they've survived. That lack of regulation is not going to stay around forever. That's one thing. It's also interesting that the energy services they're providing are on the order of, say, I don't know recently because of the LEDs, but let's say 150, 250 kilowatt hours per capita per year, right? The number 250, or say it's 500, whatever it is. In the United States, it's 13,000 today, kilowatt hours per capita per year. So the delta there is, okay, it's significant, and most of the reaction to that is, well, we're not worried about the kilowatt hours, we're worried about the services. That's certainly what Amory would have started yelling at me if he was here, and he's right. He's right in the US, but that delta is a little large for that argument. So there's still a ways to go. So that's one thing on the leapfrogging aspects. That the actual leapfrogging taking place there is business models. Now there's been, but the change of pace of technology development of photovoltaics, as you said, as anyone at NREL will show, and NREL loves that graph, right? Has everyone seen their photovoltaic decrease in cost graph, and then their graph about the efficiency, PV efficiency? Oh, they love that one especially. It's got like 50 curves on it. Dan probably invented it. It's a great graph, and it shows change going up, efficiency, bang, going up, and they're competing against the University of New South Wales. They're winning some days, not winning some days. But there's nothing leapfroggy. There's no discrete parts of those curves. Those curves go like this. There's a little jump from one number to the other, but in none of those curves is there a big jump, right, on the efficiency. So there's still the need for solid incremental change on that technology basis that is not as sexy to sell in a political way or for a budget, that I think we need to keep in mind, because it's been hugely important. So anyway, just a couple thoughts on the leapfrogging aspects of it. As far as EVs go, I, like everybody else, have no idea what it will look like. It strikes me that your point that you said sort of as an aside about the strength of the grid is pretty important in those cases, because a lot of the benefit of that is going to be how the vehicle to grid and grid to vehicle occurs. And certainly in the countries I work in, that's not they're largely not ready for that yet. At least their grid operation and things is not ready, especially when you're trying to keep up with incredible unmet demand. But certainly in some of the emerging economies, as you say, what if you made tuk-tuks all battery powered in India, or at least in the cities in the north in India? And of course, China's a totally different ballgame. So sure, it seems clear that the market for EVs is going in one direction. I'm just not sure the role in the least developed countries in the short term.
So I'm going to open it up for questions, and after this one last question, so if please be thinking of those in the meantime. I'd like to bring this back to this audience and Colorado in the West. And so I think what we've heard or talked about a little bit today is it's where the action is, I think is what Morgan said. It's growing fast, it's complicated. Policy is a big factor, and business models are often more disruptive than technology models. Also very, very driven by access to capital, and we're seeing increasing transactions south-south, right? We're seeing China, India, Brazil, Africa trade and interact with each other. For this audience, give everyone in this room one thing to take away of why should we care? And if we should care, how can we influence, participate, etc., in where this is headed?
I can start one more time. Two quick things. One would be opportunities for U.S. companies that are interested in expanding and developing markets, technology, business in international markets. We're seeing a lot of interest from China, India, beyond for, whether it's upstream technology that might be kind of represented here in the room or in Colorado, or energy efficiency technology or processes or software. So a lot of opportunity from that perspective for folks here that might be developing or commercializing that technology. I guess second point would be, we're all connected. So I've said it already, but what we do here is going to be of interest in other parts of the world too. So and vice versa. So maintaining that connection both from here to there and from there to here, I think is very worthwhile.
Yeah, that's almost a panel in and of itself. I think we could talk quite a bit about how what happens globally impacts Colorado. I guess, a quick thing is I would say the U.S. specifically and Colorado, even more in focus. We're because of the advances, oil production growth, shale gas growth, we were more and more linked with the international market than we'd ever been. We used to be large consumers energy, and we're reliant on imports to a high extent to meet that demand. That has changed dramatically over the last 10 years. And we'll just stay on the subject of gas. We are becoming and will become in the next 2 years significant exporters of gas. A lot of that initial gas will end up in Europe. It'll give our allies in Europe, sort of a second option relative to being reliant on Russia for pipe gas. It really changes the geopolitics all over the world, and the interest from Asia of what our ability to export energy on a higher and higher percentages than what we've done even 5 to 10 years ago. I think it's a big opportunity for the United States to have that position that we hadn't had before. We're much more takers now. We're providers of energy to the globe.
So on your two questions, why should you care? Well, from a business perspective, we haven't said this, but we're talking about markets of 5 billion people. So if you don't care about 5 billion people markets, you're not paying attention. So from a business perspective, it's pretty clear to me. There's a lot of other perspectives, though. There's an equity perspective, of course. A lot of the rest of the world lives in poverty, and it's important that they come out of poverty because it has a lot of co-benefits of that, including for security. That the security one plays heavily in the United States. I think it's an important co-benefit of ensuring equity or helping to ensure equity. So there's those pieces, and then there's the straight security piece where, as my colleague here from Anadarko just said, if your goal is totally insular and your goal is something like the meme of energy independence for the United States, it's largely a nonsense, right? Because if you don't understand that those markets are interconnected internationally, you're not paying attention. And so having the wrong goals matters. And you can see it for foreign policy very clearly every day. We have, probably most people don't pay attention to this, but they had a referendum in Iraqi Kurdistan on September 25th. The Iraqis voted something like 99% to have their own country free of Iraq. And 2 days later, the Iraqi forces went in and took Kirkuk, which is the main oil part of Kurdistan, or where the Kurdish government had occupied. So you can see every day from South Somalia to Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Kurdistan, Russia, that energy is intricately tied to international security. And as we all know, international security matters on domestic soil. So I think there's quite a few compelling reasons to care about these other areas. Obviously, in your day-to-day business, it might not come up every day.
So thanks much to the panel. Let's take a couple, maybe one or two quick questions before we wrap up this panel. So yes, in the middle, there's a mic coming behind you.
Hello. This is a question a little bit off of the topic, but still there. In regards to, I've been amazed over the last couple years or months when it occurred, when we had the vast oil leak of methane in California there that was spewing up. how come that thing never caught fire? What am I missing? You know?
Gas and air are hard to mix and harder to combust, and so I think that's an air-fuel ratio issue. Just rapid fire, and I'll come to you after and talk more about it. Can I get another question? Yes, back here.
Is there a nexus between countries turning to free enterprise and resulting prosperity and then resulting need for additional energy?
Who would like to take that? Morgan?
At least we're getting easy ones. Yes, there's a correlation between countries, at least development and energy demand. I mean, we can see a very clear correlation between energy demand and general development. Like if you take one axis of energy demand and the other axis of the UNDP, some indicator of development, yeah, the curve goes positive. I'm not sure if you put in a new variable called free enterprise, what that would look like, though.
Okay, to stay on track, we have to wrap up this session, but the speakers will be here in the audience, and so I encourage you to reach out. Thank you so much, and please give our speakers a round of applause.